Linda Myers left her parents' house on a Tuesday morning in August with one backpack, $40 in cash, and a bank account that had held $9,300 exactly 9 days earlier. She was 18 years old, 3 weeks out from starting nursing school at the state university 2 hours away, and she had spent the previous 4 years working every shift she could get at a diner off Route 9. Mornings before school, doubles on weekends, holidays, other kids her age spent sleeping in, specifically to build that account. Every dollar of it had a purpose. Tuition deposit. Books. The first semester's dorm fees, since the financial aid package covered most but not all of it. She had watched that number grow for 4 years with the particular disciplined patience of someone who understood, long before most people her age had to, that nobody was going to hand her anything, and that the only person she could actually count on to protect her future was herself. She remembered with a clarity that never faded, the particular Saturday she'd hit $5,000, sitting on the edge of her bed, phone in hand, staring at the number in her savings app, feeling something close to pride for the first time in longer than she could remember. She hadn't told anyone at home. She'd learned by then that good news in that house had a way of becoming someone else's opportunity rather than something to simply be celebrated, and some instinct she didn't yet have words for had told her to keep that number to herself for as long as she reasonably could. She found out the account was empty on a Sunday afternoon, standing at an ATM outside the pharmacy, trying to withdraw $20 for gas. Insufficient funds. She tried again, certain it was a mistake, a glitch, something explainable. The machine printed the same 2 words a second time. She went inside the bank the following Monday morning, and a teller named Mr. Osei, kind-faced and clearly uncomfortable, pulled up her account history and turned the monitor toward her. And Linda watched 5 years of diner tips and birthday money and careful, disciplined saving disappear across 6 transactions over the previous 3 weeks, each one a transfer to an account she didn't recognize, totaling $9,300 exactly, down to the dollar. "Do you recognize this account number?" Mr. Osei asked gently, and Linda, staring at the digits, understood with a sick, sinking clarity that she did. It was her mother's checking account, the same one Linda had once helped her mother set up online banking for, 2 years earlier, sitting at the kitchen table showing her mother patiently which buttons to press. She had given her mother the login information for her own savings account 18 months earlier, at her mother's request, framed at the time as a safety measure. "In case something happens to you, in case there's an emergency, I need to be able to help you." A request that had seemed at the time like ordinary parental caution rather than what it apparently had been all along. The quiet, patient positioning of someone waiting for the right moment to use access she'd been given out of trust. Linda went home that Monday afternoon and found her mother, Carol, in the kitchen, and asked her directly where the $9,300 had gone. Her mother didn't deny it. That, in the end, was the detail Linda would carry longest. Not the theft itself, but the ease with which her mother admitted to it, as though Linda's question were slightly unreasonable, slightly ungrateful, given the circumstances. "Your sister needed it," Carol said, not looking up from the dishes she was washing. "Vanessa's lease fell through. She needed first and last month's rent, plus a deposit, plus she needed a car repair to keep her job. We didn't have it. You did." "That was my tuition money," Linda said. "That was 5 years of work, Mom. Nursing school starts in 3 weeks. You'll figure it out," Carol said, still not turning around. "You always figure things out, Linda. You're the strong one. Vanessa isn't built like you. She needed it more than you did, and you'll be fine." Linda stood in that kitchen for a long time after her mother said it, turning the sentence over, recognizing it. She would understand only much later, with the clarity of years of distance, as the sentence that had, in one form or another, governed her entire childhood. "You're the strong one. You'll be fine." She had heard some version of it every time Vanessa, 2 years younger, got the bigger bedroom, the newer clothes, the benefit of every doubt for every failure, while Linda absorbed whatever was left over. Responsibility without resources, expectation without support, love that always seemed to arrive with a silent asterisk attached, conditional on Linda continuing to need less than everyone else in the house. Her father, Gary, came home from work that evening and found Linda still sitting at the kitchen table, and when she asked him directly whether he'd known, he'd said only tiredly, "Your mother handles the finances, Linda. I trust her judgment." It wasn't an admission of ignorance so much as an admission of a much older, more permanent kind of surrender. A father who had, at some point years earlier, simply stopped questioning how the family's resources moved between its two daughters, because questioning it had never once, in his experience, changed the outcome. Linda didn't scream. She didn't cry, not in that kitchen, not in front of them. She went upstairs, packed a single backpack, clothes, her nursing school acceptance letter, a photo of her grandmother who had died 2 years earlier and had been, Linda would later realize, the only person in that house who had ever loved her without conditions attached, and came back downstairs to find both her parents in the living room, her mother's expression carrying something that might have been guilt if it had gone any deeper than the surface, her father's carrying nothing at all. "If you leave like this, that's it," her mother said. "You're choosing to make this dramatic. We can find a way to make this work if you just be reasonable." "I am being reasonable," Linda said. "I'm leaving because you stole from me and called it helping your favorite daughter. There's nothing reasonable to negotiate." "You'll be back," her mother said, and there was something almost confident in the way she said it, the tone of a woman who had spent 18 years training her older daughter to absorb whatever the family needed absorbed, and simply couldn't imagine that training failing now at the last possible moment. "You always land on your feet, Linda. You're the strong one. You'll be fine." Linda walked out the front door with one backpack over her shoulder and $40 in her pocket, and she did not, in fact, go back. The 5 years that followed were the hardest and, in a way she wouldn't fully appreciate until much later, the most formative of her life. She called the nursing program's financial aid office the next morning, sitting on a bench outside the public library because she had nowhere else with reliable phone service, and explained with a steadiness that cost her everything she had, that her family circumstances had changed and she needed to understand what options existed for a student with no parental support and no savings. The financial aid counselor, a woman named Denise who would remain for years afterward, one of the people Linda credited with saving her life in the quietest possible way, worked with her over the following 2 weeks to restructure her aid package entirely, additional loans, a work-study position in the university health center, an emergency grant fund Linda hadn't known existed, designated specifically for students in exactly her situation. She spent that first year working 25 hours a week on top of a full nursing course load, living in the cheapest dorm option available, eating in a way that kept her thin in a manner that had nothing to do with any deliberate choice and everything to do with what she could actually afford. She slept, some nights, 4 hours before an early clinical rotation. She did not call home. Her mother called twice that first semester, brief, strange conversations in which Carol asked, almost casually, how school was going, never once mentioning the $9,300, never once apologizing, as though the theft had simply been absorbed into the family's unspoken understanding of how things worked and didn't require further comment. Linda stopped answering after the second call. She graduated nursing school 4 years later, second in her class, and took a position in the pediatric unit of a well-regarded children's hospital 90 minutes from where she'd grown up, close enough that the distance felt intentional rather than accidental, far enough that she never risked running into anyone from her old life at the grocery store. She built, over those 5 years, a life that was entirely, deliberately her own. A small apartment she'd furnished piece by piece as she could afford it, a handful of close friends from nursing school who had become something closer to family than her actual family had ever managed to be, a reputation at the hospital as the nurse other staff specifically requested for the hardest pediatric cases, the ones requiring not just clinical skill but a particular hard-won steadiness under pressure. That Linda, without ever naming it to herself this way, understood she had built entirely out of necessity, forged in a kitchen 5 years earlier by a mother who had called her theft an emergency and her daughter's fury unreasonable. There were nights in those early years when the loneliness of having no family to call caught up with her in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. A bad shift, a hard loss on the unit, the particular ache of watching other nurses' parents show up with flowers on graduation day while Linda's row of seats sat empty, filled instead by 2 friends from her cohort who had, without being asked, simply decided to be there. She grieved in those moments not really for her parents as they actually were, but for the parents she'd always hoped quietly they might someday become. A grief she eventually learned to sit with rather than resolve, understanding that some losses simply had to be carried rather than fixed. She kept, throughout those 5 years, a habit she'd developed as a teenager and never quite managed to break. A packed bag by her apartment door, small, practical, containing a change of clothes, cash, a copy of her nursing license and other essential documents. A go bag, she called it privately, though she rarely examined too closely what exactly she thought she might need to go from. It was, she understood on some level, less about any specific anticipated emergency and more about the simple, permanent lesson her family had taught her. That safety was never guaranteed, that the people who were supposed to protect you could turn out to be the reason you needed protecting, and that the only reliable insurance against that was always being ready to leave. The call came on a Thursday evening in April, 5 years and 7 months after Linda had walked out of her parents' house. She almost didn't answer. Her mother's number, unchanged in all those years, still saved in her phone under a contact name Linda had never bothered to update. But some old reflexive habit of dutifulness that 5 years of distance hadn't fully erased, made her pick up. "Linda, thank God," Carol said before Linda had even said hello, her voice carrying a particular pitch of urgency Linda recognized instantly, the tone her mother had always reserved for genuine crisis rather than manufactured drama. "It's Vanessa. It's Lily. We need your help." Vanessa, Linda's younger sister, had a daughter now, Lily, 6 years old, a fact Linda absorbed with a strange, disorienting jolt, realizing in that moment how much of her family's life had continued in her absence, entire people coming into existence that she knew nothing about. Vanessa, Carol explained in a rushed, tumbling account that took Linda several minutes to fully piece together, had been under investigation by Children's Services for the past month, after a neighbor reported finding Lily alone in Vanessa's apartment for what turned out to have been nearly 11 hours. 6-year-old Lily having let herself out to knock on the neighbor's door asking, with a self-possession that broke something in Linda's chest even secondhand, whether the neighbor had anything for dinner because her mom wasn't home yet. "Vanessa's a mess," Carol said. "She's always been fragile, you know that. She's not built the way you are, Linda. She can't handle things the way you can. But the caseworker is talking about foster care, about taking Lily away entirely, and we can't let that happen to this family." Linda sat very still, holding the phone, waiting for the actual request to arrive, because she understood by then, with the clear-eyed instinct of someone who had spent 18 years learning to read this family's true intentions beneath their stated ones, that a request was coming. "You have a good reputation," Carol continued. "A stable job, a stable life. Nobody's going to question a pediatric nurse. If you tell the caseworker you're going to help supervise things, vouch for the family, maybe even let it look like you're more involved than you actually need to be, it would go a long way toward keeping Lily with Vanessa. Toward keeping this whole thing quiet." Linda closed her eyes. There it was, not a request for her actual help, not an honest ask for her to step in and protect a frightened 6-year-old girl she'd never met, but a request to use her name, her credibility, the stable life she had built entirely without her family's help, as a kind of character reference for a system her family wanted to manipulate rather than actually fix. They weren't asking her to help Lily. They were asking her to help them look on paper like the kind of family that didn't need to be investigated at all. "Where's Lily right now?" Linda asked, her voice carrier a calm she didn't entirely feel. "With your father and me for now. Temporary. Until this all blows over." "Is she safe?" "Of course she's safe, Linda. She's with family." Linda thought, hearing that phrase, "she's with family," about every year of her own childhood in which that exact phrase had meant something very different from safety, had meant, in practice, being the strong one, being the one who figured things out, being the child whose needs were quietly, permanently deprioritized in favor of a sibling who was, in Carol's words, not built the way you are. She thought about $9,300 disappearing across 6 transactions. She thought about a 6-year-old girl knocking on a neighbor's door asking whether there was anything for dinner. "I want to see her," Linda said. "This week. And I want to talk to the caseworker directly myself, not through you." Linda, that's not really necessary. We just need you to make a statement, vouch for." "I'm not vouching for anything I haven't seen myself," Linda said. "If you want my help, that's the condition. I see Lily, I talk to the caseworker, and then I decide what I actually think is right for her. Not what's convenient for this family." The visit, arranged 2 days later at her parents' house, was the first time Linda had set foot inside that home in 5 years and 7 months, and the first time she had ever laid eyes on her niece. Lily was small for 6, watchful in a way that reminded Linda, with an ache she hadn't expected, uncomfortably of herself at that age. A child who had already learned, far too early, to read the emotional weather of a room before she said a single word, to make herself small and undemanding in a house where demands weren't welcome. She was sitting on the living room floor with a backpack beside her, packed, zipped, positioned by the door in a way that struck Linda instantly, viscerally, as far too familiar. "What's in the bag, sweetheart?" Linda asked, crouching down to Lily's eye level, keeping her voice gentle. "Pie clothes," Lily said, matter-of-fact, the way a child states an obvious fact. "In case we have to go somewhere fast. Mommy says I should always have it ready." Linda felt something in her chest crack open completely, standing in her parents' living room looking at a 6-year-old go bag that mirrored, with a precision that felt almost cruel, the one she herself had kept packed by her apartment door for the past 5 years. The same instinct, passed down not through any conversation but through the sheer, absorbed atmosphere of instability. A child learning, the way children always learn the things adults never explicitly teach them, that safety in this family was never something you could simply trust would be there. It had to be prepared for. It had to be ready to run from. She spent 2 hours with Lily that afternoon, coloring at the kitchen table, asking gentle, careful questions that Lily answered with the plain, unfiltered honesty of a child who hadn't yet learned to perform a version of events for adults' comfort. Lily talked about being alone at the apartment, a lot. About learning which neighbor's door to knock on if she got hungry. About her mother's boyfriend who yelled sometimes, and who Lily didn't like being around. About nights when her mother didn't come home until Lily had already put herself to bed. None of it was said with drama or complaint. It was said the way Lily seemed to say everything. Flatly, factually, a child reporting the conditions of her life without yet understanding that those conditions were not normal, were not what 6-year-olds were supposed to have to navigate alone. Linda left that afternoon and drove straight to the Children's Services office, requesting to speak directly with the caseworker assigned to Lily's case. A methodical, tired-eyed woman named Ms. Alvarez who had clearly handled enough family cases to recognize immediately what Linda was and wasn't offering. "I'm not here to vouch for my sister," Linda told her, sitting across a scuffed office desk. "I'm here because I want to understand what Lily actually needs, and I want you to know that whatever my parents may have told you about arranging a quiet resolution, I'm not interested in that." Ms. Alvarez studied her for a long moment. "Your family's been pushing hard for an informal supervision arrangement. Grandparents step in, everyone stays quiet, case closes without a formal custody change. And what does that actually look like in practice if Vanessa's living situation doesn't change? In my experience," Ms. Alvarez said carefully, "it looks like the same conditions continuing with slightly better paperwork." Linda drove home that night and did not sleep. She thought about the $9,300, about a family that had 18 years running, consistently chosen appearance over substance, convenience over responsibility, the comfortable story over the honest one. She thought about her own childhood, about being told she was the strong one as though strength were a resource that could be extracted indefinitely without replenishment, as though being capable meant being obligated to absorb whatever the family needed absorbed. And she thought about Lily's go bag, packed and zipped by the front door, a 6-year-old already fluent in the specific quiet vigilance of a child who has learned not to trust that the adults around her will keep her safe. She decided, somewhere around 3 in the morning, that she was not going to lend her name to a quiet arrangement that would leave Lily exactly where she was, cycling through the same conditions with better optics. She was going to pursue legal custody herself. The decision, once made, set in motion a process far more difficult and far more exposing than Linda had anticipated. She retained a family law attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Dana Whitcomb who specialized in kinship custody cases, and began over the following months, the long, grueling work of building a case, not against her sister exactly, though it would inevitably feel that way to Vanessa and her parents, but for Lily, for a stable, transparent home that didn't depend on anyone in that family successfully performing responsibility they hadn't actually developed. Her parents' response, once they understood what Linda intended, moved quickly from confusion to fury to a final, desperate attempt at manipulation that Linda would later describe, in the deposition that eventually followed, as the moment she understood with total finality that nothing about this family had changed in 5 years, only the specific crisis they were trying to use her to solve. "You're tearing this family apart," Carol told her in a phone call 3 weeks into the custody process, her voice sharp in a way Linda hadn't heard directed at her before. "We asked for one small favor and you're turning it into a war. Do you have any idea what this is doing to Vanessa? She's terrified she's going to lose her daughter because her sister decided to play hero." "I'm not playing anything," Linda said. I spent 2 hours with a 6-year-old who has a go bag packed by the door because she doesn't trust that anyone in this family will actually be there when she needs them. I know exactly what that feels like, Mom. I lived it. I'm not going to let Lily grow up the way I did and call it protecting the family. You had food. You had a roof. You're being dramatic the same way you were dramatic about the tuition money. You stole $9,300 from me and called it helping Vanessa, Linda said, her voice very level, very calm, the calm she'd built over 5 years of hard shifts and harder nights. And now you want me to help you make it look like Vanessa's fine so nobody has to actually change anything. I'm done being the strong one who absorbs whatever this family needs absorbed. I'm going to protect Lily instead. The custody case moved to a formal hearing 4 months later, and it was, Linda would say afterward, the hardest thing she had ever done professionally or personally, harder in some ways than nursing school, harder than the 5 years of scraping by on nothing, because it required her for the first time in her adult life to say out loud, under oath in a courtroom, the full true account of her own childhood, the years of quiet deprioritization, the theft of her tuition savings, the specific mechanism by which this family manufactured stability on paper while providing none of it in practice. Dana had prepared her carefully for what the hearing would demand, walking her through the kinds of questions opposing counsel might raise, the way her own history might be turned back against her. A suggestion, however implausible, that a woman with no children of her own, estranged from her family for years, might not be the most stable choice for a 6-year-old. Linda had braced herself for that line of attack and found, when it came, that she had already lived through every worse version of it in her own head a dozen times over. Nothing said in that courtroom could touch her the way her mother's voice on the phone once had. She testified for nearly 2 hours, walking the court through her own upbringing as evidence not of her own grievance but of a pattern. A family system that consistently prioritized appearance over child welfare, that had once left an 18-year-old to build her entire adult life from a single backpack and $40 rather than acknowledge wrongdoing, and was now attempting to apply the identical strategy to a 6-year-old's safety. Vanessa, present in the courtroom, cried through most of Linda's testimony, and Linda found, to her own surprise, that she felt genuine sorrow for her sister even as she continued, steadily, unwaveringly, to describe exactly why Vanessa's current situation could not be trusted to protect Lily. Sorrow because she understood, watching Vanessa's tears, that her sister too had been shaped by this family's particular calculus of who deserved support and who was simply expected to manage only. Shaped in the opposite direction, taught that she would always be caught, always be rescued, always be excused, a lesson that had left her at 30, entirely unequipped to actually parent a child on her own. The judge granted Linda full legal custody of Lily 6 weeks after the hearing concluded, citing in the written decision, both Vanessa's documented pattern of neglect and Linda's demonstrated stability, professional standing, and, a detail the judge specifically noted, her transparent, good-faith engagement with children's services throughout the process, in direct contrast to the informal, off-the-books arrangement Linda's parents had initially attempted to broker. Linda's relationship with her parents did not survive the custody battle in any meaningful form. Carol called twice in the year that followed, both times attempting some version of reconciliation that never once included acknowledgement of the tuition theft or genuine reflection on the years of unequal treatment that had shaped both of her daughters into the people who eventually stood on opposite sides of a courtroom. Linda listened both times with the same steady calm she'd carried through her testimony, and both times gently but firmly declined to reopen a relationship that had never once in 18 years demonstrated it could hold her safely. Her relationship with Vanessa surprisingly found a smaller, more honest form over the following years. Not close, not fully repaired, but real in a way their family's version of closeness had never actually been. Vanessa, after completing a court-mandated stability program and several years of consistent effort, was eventually granted regular supervised visitation. Then gradually more, and Linda made a point throughout Lily's childhood of ensuring her sister remained present in Lily's life in whatever form was actually safe and sustainable, rather than either the total exclusion or the total, unaccountable access their parents had originally wanted. Lily grew up in Linda's home knowing, in age-appropriate pieces over the years, the true story of how she'd come to live there, not as a story of villains and rescue, but as a story about a family that had struggled to protect its own children, and an aunt who had decided at real cost to herself that protecting Lily specifically mattered more than protecting the family's comfortable version of events. The go bag, once packed with a change of clothes and readiness for an emergency departure, transformed over the years into something else entirely. Linda kept the same backpack, weathered and soft from years of use, by the door of the home she and Lily built together. But its contents changed as Lily grew, clothes and documents slowly replaced by swim towels and sunscreen and snacks for weekend trips to the lake, the bag itself becoming, without either of them ever formally deciding it, a kind of quiet monument to the difference between a childhood spent in permanent readiness to flee and a childhood spent, instead, simply looking forward to where you got to go next. Linda kept working as a pediatric nurse throughout Lily's childhood, eventually specializing further in cases involving family trauma and instability, work she approached with a particular, hard-earned understanding that she suspected made her better at the job than almost anyone else on her unit. She knew from the inside exactly what it looked like when a child had learned to keep herself small, to read a room before speaking, to keep a bag packed by the door just in case. She recognized it instantly in her young patients, and she made a point always of being the adult in the room who noticed. She built, alongside Lily, the kind of small domestic rituals neither of them had fully had growing up. Sunday pancakes that were allowed to be messy, a bedtime routine that never varied no matter how hard Linda's shift had been, birthdays that were celebrated for the child having them rather than measured against a sibling's needs. She watched Lily learn, slowly and then all at once, that she was allowed to ask for things directly, that wanting something didn't need to be earned or apologized for. A lesson Linda found herself in quiet moments, still relearning alongside her. Years later, watching Lily, thriving now, 17, applying to colleges with the same disciplined ambition Linda herself had once carried, entirely unafraid in a way that still occasionally caught in Linda's throat with gratitude, to ask directly for what she needed rather than assuming she had to earn it. Linda thought often about the sentence that had once defined her own childhood, the sentence her mother had used both to justify stealing from her and to send her out the door with a single backpack: "You're the strong one. You'll be fine." She had come to understand over the years that being called the strong one had never actually been a compliment in that house. It had been an invoice quietly issued to whichever child could be trusted to absorb the most without complaint, a system that mistook a person's capacity to endure for permission to exploit it. Real love, she had learned instead, the kind she now tried every day to give Lily, didn't ask a person to be strong in place of being protected. It didn't treat resilience as a resource to be extracted. It showed up. It stayed. It packed a bag, when it packed one at all, only for the ordinary hopeful reasons. A beach day, a weekend trip, a swim towel still faintly smelling of chlorine and sunscreen, and never again for the reason Linda had once packed her own, standing in a kitchen at 18 years old, understanding for the first time that the people who were supposed to protect her had decided, quietly and without apology, that she would simply have to protect herself. Choosing her own path, Linda had come to believe, walking out of that house with $40 and one backpack all those years ago, had not been an act of abandonment, the way her mother had always framed it. It had been the first honest act of love she had ever given herself, and though she couldn't have known it standing on that porch at 18, the first step toward becoming exactly the kind of family Lily would eventually finally get to have.